October 17, 2019. A secure server farm deep beneath the Nevada desert. The air hums, a low, constant frequency that vibrates in the chest. Someone, a specialist whose name we will never know, is watching lines of code scroll by. They see it, a small, almost invisible digital signature, embedded deep within the operating system of a brand new, top-of-the-line surveillance drone. It's not a bug. It's a backdoor. And the alarming realization hits them. The vulnerability wasn't accidentally introduced by a careless programmer in Silicon Valley. It was engineered. It was planted. How did the most sophisticated surveillance technology developed by American Ingenuity end up speaking the language of Beijing's Ministry of State Security? This single line of compromised code is the thread that unravels everything. We always assumed the technological arms race was about secrecy, about building walls around our advancements. But what if the greatest vulnerability wasn't a failure to protect our secrets, but the very act of giving them away? The clock flashes 3:14 a.m. The specialist doesn't alert the chain of command immediately. They know that once they speak, the story becomes political, corrupted, so they dig deeper, tracing the digital breadcrumbs back across continents, back across years of seemingly benign collaboration, back to the moment American brilliance decided it could profit from partnership, regardless of the consequences. The realization crystallizes. For decades, the greatest competitive advantage the United States possessed was its hardware, its software, its sheer intellectual capital. We built the tools that define the modern world, and now those very tools are humming the tune of our most formidable global adversary. This is the story of how Silicon Valley, driven by relentless pursuit of market share and frictionless global integration, inadvertently laid the fiber optic cables for China's global surveillance network. It's the story of the ghost in the code, the early 2000s. The digital gold rush is on. Startups are springing up like wildfire, fueled by venture capital that demands exponential growth. Now, the biggest market, the one promising billions of new users, is on the other side of the Pacific. To get access, you don't just sell, you partner, you localize, you share. We see the early pioneers, brilliant engineers fresh out of Stanford and MIT, arriving in Shenzhen. They aren't thinking about national security, they are thinking about market penetration. They are told by their corporate lawyers that this is standard procedure, that sharing source code for customization is the key to unlocking the world's largest consumer base. Every agreement contains clauses about joint ventures, about adapting the operating system to local regulatory requirements. These requirements, at the time, seem innocuous. Data localization laws, mandatory local encryption standards. But these localized adaptations become the insertion points. The U.S. companies, desperate to avoid the headache of building entirely separate infrastructure, agree to incorporate the required local modifications directly into the master build. They ship the blueprints for their most advanced processors, their most secure network protocols, under the guise of compliance. Think of it like building a skyscraper. You hire the best structural engineers in the world. They design the skeleton. Then a local subcontractor insists on using a specific, slightly different type of rebar for the foundation, claiming it handles local seismic activity berserk. You approve it because you trust their certification, because you want to finish the building on schedule. You don't realize that rebar has a microscopic stress fracture built into every segment, a flaw that won't appear until the building is fully loaded, until the network is live, until the pressure is applied. The narrative shifts now, tracing the evolution of these compliance features. Initially, the data being collected is consumer information, purchasing habits, social connections, travel patterns, harmless viewed through the lens of quarterly earnings reports. But the access granted is absolute. The backdoor, built initially for regulatory auditing, is a perfect undetectable master key. The key moment arrives around 2015. China pivots. The consumer data collection phase is complete. The infrastructure is laid. Now the focus shifts from monitoring the population to monitoring the world. The same infrastructure that analyzed purchasing patterns for iPhones is now leveraged to map the logistics networks of foreign governments, to identify key personnel within international corporations, to track dissidents abroad. The initial U.S. partners, the massive cloud providers, the semiconductor giants, the enterprise software developers. They are no longer in control of the data flows. They provided the architecture, but the operational control has been ceded through years of mandated dependency. The specialist in Nevada is watching the drone telemetry data now. They see a pattern emerging. The drone, built using U.S. microchips and running U.S.-derived flight control software, isn't just mapping agricultural land as its public mission dictates, it's hovering, for extended periods, over sensitive military bases in Southeast Asia, feeding high-resolution thermal images back to a destination server cluster that doesn't belong to the drone operator. The transmission is masked, disguised as standard telemetry updates, a familiar digital signature that the U.S. engineers themselves wrote into the protocol years prior, ensuring smooth debugging across international borders. The crucial knowledge gap begins to close. The U.S. tech giants didn't build a direct wire to Beijing. They built a self-sustaining, perfectly legal ecosystem of compliance and cooperation, a Trojan horse disguised as a global supply chain. The ghost wasn't a piece of malware, it was the acceptance of shared protocols. We zoom back to the funding mechanism. Who pushed hardest for the deep integration in those early years? The internal memos, unearthed years later in a separate data breach investigation, tell a chilling story of internal conflict. Engineers raise red flags about the opacity of the local partners' access requests. They use words like unnecessary depth and suspicious administrative overhead. But these warnings are consistently overruled by mid-level executives. The mandate from the C-suite is clear. We cannot cede market share to local competitors who are willing to comply. The cost of ethical hesitation is market dominance. Fear of losing the next billion users outweighs the abstract threat of geopolitical compromise. And the U.S. government? They were complicit, not through malice, but through optimism. They believed that economic integration would inevitably lead to political liberalization. They encouraged the sales, the partnerships, the integration, seeing American technology as a soft power export, believing that the more entrenched U.S. standards became globally, the safer America would be. They failed to grasp that in a state-controlled environment, every piece of integrated technology immediately becomes a national asset for the controlling power. The sound of a system alert flashes briefly in the background of the Nevada bunker, a high-pitched, almost subliminal tone. The specialist has found the genesis point. It wasn't a vulnerability in the final product. It was a specific library, a common piece of open-source code used for encrypted communication, championed by a U.S. developer in 2011 as a revolutionary leap in efficiency. This library, which formed the backbone of secure communications across countless U.S. defense and commercial platforms, contained a subtle, almost untraceable dependency chain. That dependency led directly back to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, which funneled funding to a research institute in Beijing, which then seeded the optimized code into the public domain, waiting for global adoption. The U.S. innovators, seeking efficiency, adopted the code wholesale. They sped up deployment, they slashed testing time, they cut costs. They never audited the sub-dependencies because legally they didn't have to. The code was open source. The trap was sprung through the very spirit of collaboration that defines the best of American technology. Back in 2019, the specialist isolates the drone's transmission log. The data package being sent is massive, far exceeding the expected bandwidth for simple flight telemetry. They run a decryption key, one that should only work for authorized internal maintenance personnel. It unlocks instantly. The files reveal not just drone locations, but detailed schematics of a newly built, highly advanced particle accelerator facility in the American Midwest, a facility operated entirely by a private contractor using U.S.-made, commercially available networking gear. The contractor had used the standardized U.S.-approved encryption protocols which, unbeknownst to them, contained the foundational vulnerability gifted years earlier. The ghost wasn't just in the code, it was in the trust we placed in the mathematical elegance of the algorithms themselves. The final moments ticked down. The specialist has confirmed the scope, Horeli 6.4 the Tokafti as a Kaibagnarvidozeks. Hundreds of services, in workals of 49. It was of a series that was paddle of portrait from the Vadia Kotomic Granite Kasham to Platic Carrion Sound, and 50 nearly lettered the Geminiums enter Venata by Indisro. The sculling dancer and much stuff with meal and this general, not in its very solid way they cut this white filers to the clamp of hiling, the stating in the sheetus. Our is external I am star drilling the one that of a first in the world was that.